So I'm not going to spend too much time introducing myself. Hopefully you read the bio, but basically both Lindsay and I are user experience professionals. I have a software development background a long time ago, but I've been doing UX and UX research for a long time now. And yeah, so Bertold really introduced or invited us to present. We did this presentation internally at Mabel a little while ago. And so it's not about testing per se, but hopefully it's about something that you can apply in your day-to-day job or life. So we're going to go through this. Hopefully it can be interactive. If you want to throw your questions or comments into the chat as we go, or just unmute yourself, I'm happy either way. This is the first virtual presentation I've done, so we'll see how it goes. Do you want to say anything, Lindsay, before I jump into the first slide?
Just if you're curious about me, I have a background in market research, so I have a master's in that. And like Jay said, I'm a UX professional at Mabel as well. That's it.
Cool. Okay, so number one, thanks for coming. I'm sure there are probably like a million online meetups, happening right now that you could be at, or you could be watching Netflix. So thanks for coming. So like I said, we're just going to share some tips and tricks that we use as a matter of habit, really, when we're speaking with people about the work they do. This presentation is we're going to give it in the context of like the research or interviews that we generally run, but we'll just we'll point out how really everything we're talking about is applicable, even just if you're talking to somebody at a party, say, if we ever do that again. So we hope you'll come away with a few tips or techniques that you can apply when talking to somebody, just to learn how they do their job, or just as a matter of interest. So I guess first question is, and if you can somehow indicate whether it's in the participants list by raising your hand or whatever, but have who here has any experience observing or sitting in on a UX research, like a user interview or usability test, that sort of thing? So I see a couple. I don't actually see. I see a couple thumbs up. Excellent. I can't actually open the participants list, so hopefully I'm seeing everything. But so that's kind of what that's the context that we're thinking about when we present this. And so it'll be interesting if you think about those experiences, just to see if they align with what we're talking about. It's always interesting to hear. So Lindsay and I are going to tag team back and forth through this, and so Lindsay's going to speak to the next slide here about what's the big deal here anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I mean, the purpose of this question, is just like, why are we telling you about this? Why is it helpful to know, the correct way, or to have the tips and tricks to talk to your users? And that is because it can be difficult, right? So there's a few reasons, and we have a few listed here. The first is it could be awkward to give people negative feedback about a product that they work for or a company that they work for. So something to keep in mind is, it's important to, and we'll give you tips and tricks later on how to do this, but it's important to try to make the user feel as comfortable as possible. So they know that they can give you negative feedback, and it's okay. And it's encouraged, if anything. Another thing that they might do is these participants or people in the conversation might avoid telling you that they don't understand something. So whether it's they don't understand something that you are asking them about, or they don't understand something with your product, it could be something that they might not feel comfortable to share. So that's important to keep in mind as well. And then kind of going along with that, they might feel the need to act as people pleasers. And what we mean by that quote or that phrase is that they might just be telling you everything that you want to hear. You know, if I ask Jay about the onboarding of a particular product, he might just say, oh yeah, it's great, because that's what I think that Lindsay as a UX researcher at Mabel wants to hear, and I want to make her happy in this call. And then another thing that's really interesting is oftentimes if you're asking them a person about their job and what they do day to day in their job, it could be pretty hard to remember exactly what they are doing. You know, in your day to day, if someone were to ask you, again, like I just said, someone were to ask you, you know, what do you do on your day-to-day activity? I might say 2 things, but forget about the 3 other things that I do subconsciously that I might not remember. I think we can go to the next one, Jay. So yeah, so now I'm going to transfer over into the part of where we, now that we know why it's difficult to talk to users and some of the difficulties there, here's where we start telling you some of the advice that we have to make these better. So one thing that's really important is planning. It might seem obvious, but it's really important to, you know what you want to learn from this other individual. You have to go in there with some sort of goal in mind, even if it's an informal goal. It doesn't have to be something that you write down. You don't have to write down this whole guide to follow when you're planning. But it's important to know and stay focused on what you want to find out from this person and their job and what they do. So like I just said, you know what you want to learn and also plan what you're going to ask. Thinking of questions ahead of time, if you have the opportunity to think of questions ahead of time, is really helpful so you stay on track. But, you know, even in the moment, just keep reminding yourself what you are trying to accomplish here. And then lastly, on the planning aspect, we have, you know, if you do have the opportunity to plan these interviews or these conversations ahead, think about who you want to ask. Oftentimes, you'll have questions, but you have to think about the right person to ask to get those answers. So that's a really important thing as well. Go ahead, Jay. Yep.
Cool. So yeah, so a typical like interview has 3 major parts, and which is introduction, you introduce yourself, make some small talk, you know, try to make this complete stranger you're talking to realize that you're both human, and then you get into the questions or observations. Talk a bit more about why both of those terms are used here, and then you wrap things up. So of course this applies to most conversations with people, and I think, you know, if you are especially, this is actually, some of these tips are really great for introverts, where it's, you know, hard to think of what to say, and so a lot of these techniques are about getting the other person to talk, and so these are actually great tips for the small talk or the, you know, meeting new people. So yeah, so let's talk a bit about the introductions a bit more. So, you know, the whole point here is to build a bit of rapport, and to, you know, put everybody at ease. So in the case of like an planned interview or usability test, the person that participating might not have any idea what is going to happen in the session. So that's really important. And if there is, you know, if there is any uncertainty about what's happening, it's always good to know what's coming. And you could, if you're talking to somebody in any situation and you don't know what's going to happen next, like in an interview, for example, you can always ask, you know, so how, you know, what's the agenda here? The other thing, yes, for more, you know, formal UX stuff, there's often people observing. You want to let the person know it's like the right thing to do, etc. So, and if you're recording, you know, like we're told, asked us before, you know, ask for permission. That's the law. So, the other thing, when I am interviewing a user, I always tell them that there are no wrong answers. If anything, you know, the interviewer's in a learning role, almost as if they're like an apprentice. So I'll turn it over to Lindsay to talk about questions.
Great. Yeah. So naturally, after the introduction, questions would come next in this interview or conversation that you're having. Something that's important to start with is being as broad as you can. So like start with all the general questions. And one, because it's easier to answer the general questions before you get to some more of the complex ones. So it gives the user or the participant this sense of like comfortability because they know how to answer these questions, and it also starts to get them talking. So even it just makes them comfortable to be answering questions in general to a complete stranger that they don't know yet. Something else is do your best to use their jargon or their terminology. Full disclosure, before starting at Mabel, I didn't know much about QA testers or the QA testing space or software testing space at all. So I did do a lot of research before my first interviews to try to know as much terminology as I can. Yeah, which it makes them more comfortable. It's just a better positive experience. And then next, so again, if this is like a premeditated interview or conversation and you can, and it happens to be virtual or in person, do your best to like, if you ask them to show something and not tell something, you're gonna get oftentimes different or more information out of it. And so what I mean is if I, am asking someone a question and it's on a product or a feature that they were testing earlier that day and they mentioned that, I might ask them to share their screen and show me what they were working on. And that, provides more insight for me as the interviewer. And it also might spark up, better follow-up questions, which leads me to my next point of asking follow-up questions. So these are questions that are unplanned and they come up just casually in the conversation, but make sure that you don't, you do your best to try to not miss an opportunity to really deep dive into something that's interesting to you and providing value to you that the user or the person is saying. And then lastly, some things to avoid. So try your best to avoid, biased questions. And my next slide will be talking more about some examples of these. So I'll share some examples after this. Do your best to avoid yes or no questions. It's better, instead of asking a yes or no question, to ask, their opinion on something, and then naturally they'll give you more information on that instead of just saying yes, and then they don't say anything else after that. And then another thing is to avoid hypothetical questions. They just don't provide as much insight as other questions do. I'm just going to read the chat. Sorry. No one starts off as a great user interviewer. What ways have you seen someone who is considering a great interviewer to transfer their capability to others? Pairing with the junior observer, exercises with internal users. Yeah, great question, Paul. I can definitely speak to that, and then I'll give Jay a chance as well. And then I'll continue on further with the talk. But when I first started interviewing users at Mabel, I actually did use Jay as a source and someone to talk to. So I observed a lot of his sessions that he was doing, or his interviews that he was doing, to help me understand kind of some of his tricks that he would do, and as well as others just kind of in the industry as well. You can even find probably some great user sessions that are like public and available to everyone. And then another thing that I would say is I usually try to, if there's time, I do exercises with internal users. Oftentimes it's Mabel employees before I actually ask the Mabel users. Even my first week at Mabel, I think I interviewed Bertold for practice and to see his viewpoint. Jay, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously getting feedback from somebody who's watching is always great. And it is, in my experience, it's all practice. Like I think like early on, when I was learning about how to do this better, the neutral question asking that Lindsay's going to go into a little bit in the next slide was one of the things that really stuck out for me. And I would try to keep that stuff in mind. And then I would, I'd be interviewing somebody and I'd ask them like this closed question, like, how, was that good? And I would just, metaphor, or not literally, but kick myself in the butt for doing that. But, and the other thing I find, so it's just, you just need to practice, and you need the feedback, whether it's, realizing you've done it, rewatching your own interviews if you record them, and just practicing and getting better. The other thing that I would just point out is that it is a skill that if you don't practice it continuously, you will get rusty. And so I don't know, I liken it to like job interviewing. If you've had a job for a long time, and you go out for that first interview, I don't know about you, but my first interview just sucks so badly. And it's the same with interviewing. You have to keep these skills fresh. So yeah, it's a great question though.
Great. You can go to the next slide, Jay. And just lastly on that question, one more comment. I think, like I was talking before, if you do have the time to plan out some of the questions beforehand, like if it's a more formal, like, you're going to be talking to this person, what you want to ask them about. If you write the questions down, like in the correct way, even if you're, reading it off of a guide that's next to you while you're talking to this person, the more and more that you do that, and even if you're reading off of it the first time, the more natural it's going to feel. And you're going to, like Jay said, sometimes neutral questions are hard, but you'll catch yourself because you're so used to practicing doing it the right way. So yeah, that translates great into neutral questions. So we have some examples here. In layperson's terms, the gray color is not a good way to ask, and the purple color is a good way to ask. So for example, if you're asking if you're comparing something and you're asking them, is A better than B? A better way to say that would be, how would you compare A to B? Sometimes if you use the word better and whatever you say last, so in this case, the B, oftentimes the user or the person that you're talking to is more likely to just agree and say, oh yeah, A is better than B, because that's the way that you phrased it. But it's just more natural to, to be broader, just like, how would you compare these two? And then you let the user kind of take you whatever direction that they go to. Another example is, do you like this idea? Sometimes when you use the word like, or even the word dislike, if you said, do you dislike this idea? That sticks in their head. So they're more likely to agree with it. Or, I don't like this idea, but I like this other thing. But a better thing to ask is more neutral again, just like, what do you think of this? What do you think of this idea? Moving on, is this something you use frequently or infrequently? There's this rule out there that whatever in or statements, whatever you say second or last, so this case infrequently is what the person is more likely to respond, because it's the last thing that they hear. So a better way to ask that is, how often do you use that? And then they'll give you that information, whether it's frequent or infrequent. And then lastly, this last one kind of pertains more to a usability test. So if you are watching this user, this person, like actually do some kind of action, and, for example, maybe you're watching them do something in your product and you notice that they click something, they click a link, instead of saying, why did you click that link? It's sort of kind of accusatory, and, I don't know, could make them a little uncomfortable. It's just, not the best way to ask. So instead, I noticed that you clicked that, or you did that action, but you navigated away immediately. Like, why did you do that? So that's just one example there. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jay.
I thought I had something to add to that, but I think I lost my thought. So let's move on. All right, so asking the questions is half the battle, but you also need to get the answer and like process it and know where to go next. So, and you also need to make the person you're speaking with actually feel like you're engaged and interested. So active listening, I'm sure you've all heard the term. It is really important, so that you you look engaged, you are engaged, and you will just get the best answers possible. Depending, you know, again on the context, but it's certainly for like usability work or user interviews, you want to keep your reactions neutral for the most part, because you don't want to appear that you're judging or anything like that. Often in these cases, there is this kind of disparity between, you know, your role and their role and who's kind of in charge, right? So you, especially in this case, you want to be neutral. And this last one is really the best, or the third one rather. Just shut up. When you're talking to somebody, even in an interview like this, but certainly socially, people, they just love to. People are very uncomfortable when there is a break in the conversation, and they will feel the need to speak. And so, especially one-on-one like this is a great way to get them to keep talking. You know, like just going back a slide a second, the last one there where you don't want to be accusatory, you know, accusatory when you say, why'd you click that? And you can see this, I noticed you clicked that link, ... And again, this doesn't have to be a usability test. This could be, you're just watching somebody using, you know, your product, or you're learning how they're doing something in their job. So that ... there is really where you just make this observation and you just be quiet, and people will then kind of pick up on that and know it's their turn to speak. So again, I think this is a great tip for introverts like me, and it does work. And while you're being quiet, you can also just kind of think about what the person just said. And that's a great time to think about follow-up questions like, is this interesting to me? Do I want to learn more? Or do I want to ask a different, you know, start a different line of questioning kind of thing? So yeah, so Lindsay's next here, some tips, more tips and advice.
Great, yeah, more tips. So keep it professional. That also probably, I'm sure you've heard that before. Yeah, do your best to keep it professional. You know, the more informal you are, the more informal they are, and it might not solicit the best advice depending on the, you know, environment that you're in or what you need to know. Going off of what Jay just said about, you know, eliciting the silence and getting the feedback. Yeah, just embrace that awkward silence. If you couldn't tell, I'm pretty extroverted. So for extroverts like me, it could be very, very awkward to kind of just, you know, stop talking and let them lead me the right way. But oftentimes, or every time, honestly, if I, you know, ask the question or make a statement and I am just quiet, they will feel awkward as well, and they will feel it. And I'm going to answer. Hold on. There's one more chat. Let's see. I've seen people who are receiving the responses say good, which is positive, and not agree, disagree. Yes. Is that if you're talking, Paul, about like a filler, like, are you saying good, like a filler word instead of saying it? Yes. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's a great neutral filler. I would agree.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do say too.
It's definitely important to keep the back and forth going, because those are like incredibly important cues.
Yeah. Great. And then, you know, remember that you're talking to a human being. This is sometimes you could forget when you get kind of very professional and robotic with it. But yeah, you got to find a good balance of like, this is professional. I need to know this information. So I need to get it, but also this is a human being. So if they can't remember something, or they don't know the answer to something, that's completely okay. They're a human being, you know. And then if you have the opportunity, it's really beneficial to have someone else take notes. So like a coworker of yours, that way you can think of those follow-up questions and you're more like in the moment. Another thing that you could do for that is asking to record. So you're not like frantically taking notes because you want to, you know, everything that they're saying is valuable and you want to know everything. You have someone else to do that, or you have a video to go back and refer to. Another thing is, you know, don't be afraid to ask for a moment as the person asking questions. Like if I need to make a note or think, or, you know, just take a minute, it's fully okay to just say, hey, you know, can you hold on a minute? I want to jot that down, or, you know, just that's okay. And don't feel uncomfortable in doing so. And then like Jay said earlier, practice, like, you know, it's cliche, but practice really does make perfect, or nearly perfect. You know, everyone can always improve, but yeah, the only way that this is going to get easier and more natural is if you practice.
So yeah, some pitfalls and challenges. So yeah, you know, and this goes towards the practice thing too. After every interview, there's always like, oh, I wish I had asked more questions about this. I thought I understood, you know, why they said that they cut a hole in the ice to you know, start their ice fishing session, but I don't really understand why it's a round hole, not a square hole, or whatever, you know. And it might be important. If you're setting something up, getting the right person, Lindsay mentioned this earlier, is really important. You know, you start talking, asking questions about person's work, and you realize you're talking to somebody who doesn't really do what you're interested in. That's a bit of a waste of time. And so if you're actually recruiting people, then there's techniques to get the right people. You ask them to fill out a questionnaire, a screener, and you just make sure that at some level they seem like the right fit. And, you know, again, time allotted for the session, that's also really hard sometimes to get everything you want out of, you know, a half an hour, or sometimes even an hour is not enough depending on what you're trying to learn. And people are different, right? There are people who won't stop talking and might even talk about things you really don't want to hear. And then there are the ones that just, you know, it's like pulling teeth to get a word. So the talkers, it's, you know, it depends on, again, the context in an interview. As the interviewer, you probably have a bit more control in terms of interrupting them and steering them the right way. For non-talkers, when we're talking about like research into what people do, how they do things, really the key thing is to get them to show you and not just tell you about it, which is a more reliable way to learn what somebody is really doing in reality anyway. Because, you know, you can, you know, if I asked you what you did this morning to get ready for work, you could tell me you had breakfast, had a shower, got dressed. Maybe it was in that order, maybe it wasn't. Maybe that order to me is important, but I'm going to get the wrong answer if I'm not actually there. Or if I got you to replay, it's a bad example, but if I got you to replay that morning for me, you might actually show me what actually happened. So there's different ways to observe work, whether it's seeing it as it happens, or seeing somebody like just walk you through it. But it's always a great way to deal with somebody who's not that talkative, and it's the best way to get information about anything people do. So the other thing here, this is also a big one when if you're going to take away this information to do something with it, is you have to really be aware of the differences between what somebody says or shows you even, and the conclusions you draw from it. So, you know, there's lots of cases where this applies. It's really, this is drawing like some conclusion from really partial data. And when you're talking about people, you never have the complete picture, because we're talking about what, you know, usually what's going on in their head. So, but a place where this can happen is in any usage analytics, like Google Analytics. We use a product called Full Story, which, you know, records user sessions with our product and shows you exactly what somebody did. So you can look at this data and you can make these, you can draw these conclusions that, you know, who knows if they're correct, right? Like you see paths in Google Analytics that, you know, say that people take this weird detour in your product and go to the screen that you know, just surprises you. And like, why is that? Are all these people confused? Are they, you know, is there some element on the screen that is drawing their attention? Like, you don't really know, especially just from this raw data. Full Story is really interesting because they have a couple of metrics that just kind of like scream inference, which they've got like a rage click. So if somebody clicks in like one location like multiple times, Full Story will say that this is a rage click. And so the implication there is that this person's really frustrated or angry, whereas that might not be true. And like just another one, when you're talking to somebody and they yawn, like what does that mean? Does it mean that you're really not engaging them and it's a failure on your part? Does it just mean that they're tired because their kid kept them up all night? Or maybe they actually have two jobs and you're speaking to them after their second shift, but you don't know that. And this is a true story, and it just kind of shows you that you really have no clue what's going on in somebody's head. So I did an in-person usability test a long time ago, where this user that had come in, and we're sitting there, and it was like in the afternoon, and he just didn't seem all that engaged. And we're going through these tasks, and I just couldn't figure out what was wrong. Something seemed really off. And so I asked him at one point, and he told me that he had just come back from a business trip, and he came home to find that his wife had left him and taken herself and the kids away. And so of course I'm feeling horrible for this man. But my other thought, I don't know if it was then or later, but here's somebody who came to a usability test who could have canceled. There's nothing about this obligation that was really meaning he really had to come, and yet he still came, and he's still participating as if everything is okay, and he's not performing the task very well. And if I hadn't asked that question, I could have chalked it up to I would never have thought of chalking his performance up to the fact that his wife had just left him. So you really never know, and so drawing conclusions is really risky. So Lindsay will talk about what you can do at having done this interview or information gathering.
Great, yeah, thanks, Jay. So whether you want to call it, analyzing this data, this qualitative data that you just received from talking to these people or person, or, you want to call it just sharing the information, whether it's with your coworker, with someone in your family, whoever you want to tell about this, interesting information you just found out. Here are some things that you can think about when you go about talking and, telling someone else about that data. So naturally, usually what happens is this information overload where human beings are interesting, and if you talk to them for a half hour, 99% of what they said was interesting to you. So it could be, it's usually a good idea to have these sort of key takeaways, and just so if you're, the top 3 things that were the most interesting and the most valuable to you in that session. Another thing to think about is if you talk to more than one individual, finding commonalities or patterns, between what the first person said and the third person said, or, what have you. Usually if more than one person's saying it, it holds a little bit more value. And then similarly to major differences, if it's, one person absolutely loved this part of your product, but the other person did not, and 3 other people didn't, and 2 people liked it, and there's all these differences, that's pretty notable. So it's definitely something to note. And then any surprises, anything that you're wow, that is so interesting, I would totally not think that, that could be good as well to share. And then lastly, something to think about is, do you still have any questions after talking to these people? Is there anything else that you still want to know? In the beginning, we talked about trying to do your best to set some goals for the interview and the planning phase. And did you obtain those goals, or are there next steps? And if there are next steps, what are they? Are you going to talk to more people? Are you going to do some, secondary research on your own? What is it that you need to know to get the information that that you want and that you need? it, Jay.